Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. This week, I thought I would continue the personal stories about Afghanistan and my time as commander of Kandahar Airfield on a NATO role in 2008. And I thought I'd talk about going out on patrol. And by that, I mean out on patrol with the Royal Air Force Regiment, who were part of the force protection team that I had. They were responsible for all of the external off-the-base force protection for the entire ground defense area, about 450 square kilometers of territory that we had around the airfield. And day in, day out, they would be out there doing that. Their primary role in doing that was to ensure the safety for air travel in and out of the airfield, so protecting the air lanes for departure and recovery particularly, but also obviously to stop, as far as they could, the Taliban from throwing rockets across the fence into the base. So trying to protect the base as a whole at distance rather than as protecting it on the wire or even worse, inside the wire. So they were kind of our outer ring of defense throughout the time. And I went out with them. And you might well ask, what on earth was I doing going out with them as the boss of the base? You know, it's not my job to go and do that. There were several reasons for doing it. Very early on, I decided, in fact, even before I got to the job, I decided this was something I was going to do, not all the time, but pretty regularly, probably every couple of weeks. I would go out with them on a patrol. And I did it for several reasons that were not gratuitous at all. One was I really passionately believe leading by example is really, really important. And this was a very risky endeavor that the guys were being asked to go and do, and they were all guys. The RAF regiment at that stage was entirely male, and so I was conscious that I wanted to have some skin in the game with them. I'm asking them to take that risk. I needed to show them that I was prepared to actually do that and share that risk with them. There were also some practical things from my own perspective as the commander of the airfield, in that we did quite a lot of key leader engagement, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And we also did quite a lot of projects. Again, I'll talk more about that in a minute, where we were helping the local population. And in both those cases, I had a role to kind of be there and talk to tribal elders, et cetera, et cetera. So it was important that I was there. It was equally important to me that if I was going to go and do it, I wasn't a passenger for them. I wasn't sort of just a burden that they had. And I was fully capable, fully trained up, fully up to speed, as it were, to be able to look after myself and, if necessary, look after them in extremis as well. So I could play my part with first aid, etc. I could play my part with weaponry if I actually needed to do that. It was very unlikely to happen. And they were very conscious. Obviously, they were looking after me rather than the other way around. And that was the right way to be. But I equally was quite clear that it was very important that I blended in as part of them and was not highlighting myself unnecessarily. That would be a stupid thing to do, and bring more risk on the patrol as a whole, as opposed to anything else. But also that just generally I was fully capable. So I thought it'd be quite a good episode to talk about some of that, because I think it's of interest to lots of people about what actually was it like in that environment, and equally what sort of things did we do and how did we put those patrols together. Now, I'm pretty clear in my own mind that if you look at Afghanistan as a whole, there were various different kind of elements to what went on out there. There were big bases like Kandahar, which were inside the wire, somewhat of a sanctuary for an awful lot of people who were off the base regularly and doing some of the serious fighting. They could come back and actually get some serious respite by being on the base. But also they were obviously the hub for a lot of other activity that was going on. But the risk element on the base was nowhere near what it was off the base. But equally, off the base, there were two different levels of risk. There was the kind of stuff that our guys were facing daily, where actually we were at risk, and I'll talk more about that in a different episode in some detail about the what happens when tragedy strikes, as it were, because that is definitely a factor. But it was not Helmand Province, or indeed the bits of Kandahar Province where the Canadians were fighting. Helmand was obviously where the majority of the British soldiers were fighting, where they were actually in full-on contacts regularly, routinely with the Taliban, and it was a much more full war fighting kind of environment. We weren't really in that space. We were in the rear ground, which was relatively, and I use the word advisedly, safe compared to some of the real frontline elements of Helmand. But nonetheless, it was pretty damn risky. I mean, there were a lot of Taliban rockets fired over the wire while I was there, and also quite a lot of risk off the base, and including some that unfortunately claimed the lives of a couple of my guys. So it would be completely wrong to assume it was safe, but it was certainly, I wouldn't wish to compare it with the fighting on the ground in Helmand. I think that would be inappropriate. And the guys who were in some of the patrol bases and so on deep in Helmand, deep in enemy territory, were finding it really, really tough. So there's a difference between those two things. But getting to what we actually did, how we set it all up, I mean, the start, obviously, is around preparation. It's around looking at, right, what are we going to do? What's the mission on this particular patrol? Not the generic mission that I've already described. This is, what are we going to try and achieve with this particular patrol on this particular day? Where are we going to go? What kind of ground are we going to cover? What are we looking for? What kind of objectives are they looking to achieve? And then overlaying that with the intelligence picture as best we could from all source intelligence that we could pick up. And I won't go into too much of the detail of that for obvious reasons, but we had quite a good picture of what was going on, where we were likely to be at greater threat, where we had seen recent signs of activity that we needed to be cautious about. And obviously, if we were going to do something like a particular piece of key leader engagement and so on, that was a vulnerable space. We needed to be very clear about that, and we wanted to make sure that we'd taken appropriate precautions before we got there, and obviously while we were there, and I'll come back to that point as well. So there was a lot to it in the preparation phase, a lot that went on behind the scenes before I certainly got involved in any given patrol, and then that culminated, just as with a flying mission, with a brief. There was a planning phase and a putting it all together and making sure everyone was ready to go, and then we briefed as a patrol, and everyone went through exactly what was going on, who had what roles, who had what responsibilities, and those were very clearly defined because it was important that people understood exactly what they were going to do during the time we were outside the wire, and what they were going to do, particularly in the case of things going wrong, including obviously in some kind of action where we get engaged by the Taliban, and or anything else that hitting an improvised explosive device or a mine, or some unexpected encounter that we just had not anticipated. So all of those things formed a really important part of the brief to make sure that before they walked out the door, everyone on the patrol was clear what they were doing, where they were needing to be at any given time, and how the thing was expected to run, and a whole load of contingency elements to that to make sure that in the event that it didn't quite run as planned, they knew who was going to do what. We would always go with an appropriate mix of people and backgrounds. So we had people obviously who were radio operators and good with communications. We had people who were excellent with first aid. And it's worth saying that the combat medics that went out on these patrols are paramedic standard medics. I mean, they're really highly trained. They had to be prepared to and capable of dealing with the most traumatic of injuries if people were blown up in an improvised explosive device, etc. But equally, of course, there was the risk that the medic themselves might actually get injured. And so everybody in the patrol was capable of basic first aid and self-aid. And that was one of the tenets that was really important. So we would carry equipment, including tourniquets that we could actually administer. You could administer that with one hand yourself to actually turn around and cut off the blood if you'd had some kind of serious injury. We used to go with some quick clotting powder that would enable you to clot quickly any kind of significant bleeds, and a range of other things that you had on your person to basically make sure that you could turn around and give yourself some aid. Obviously, field dressings, etc. That you could provide some bandages for yourself, and that was obviously important because if you were hit by something like an IED, the immediate concern would be: is there another device? Is there something else that's going to get triggered? That was a very common tactic, would clearly be to try and bring people into the scene of the first explosion and then detonate something else, or have a sniper or whatever that was actually going to engage you. So quite often, if you were injured on the ground, you were going to be looking after yourself for at least a little bit before people could actually get to you to provide better aid. At which point, then obviously in that instance, then the whole system kicked into action, assuming you had good communications, which we invariably did. You would initialize, if needed, the medical emergency response team would come up by helicopter to actually extract you off the battlefield. By and large, that wasn't an issue for us. It was much, much more of an issue for the Helmand Kandahar kind of region, where whether it was the Brits or the Canadians who were actually fighting in those areas, and they had really, really tough time. Where obviously some of them got very, very seriously injured, and the MERT was an amazing thing. I'll talk more about that in another episode in terms of some of the stuff that went on off the base in air terms. The self-sufficiency point went beyond just aid. Obviously, you carried your kit and you carried your water, you carried your rations, and made sure you had what you needed for the patrol and beyond the patrol. Because although you had a planned assumption that you're going to go out for a certain amount of time, you're firmly in the lap of stuff happening, and the risk was that you could actually have to stay out quite a lot longer than you had originally intended, and therefore you needed to be able to make sure you could cater for that without it being some kind of major drama. Obviously, weaponry was really important. We are firmly in a war zone here, so everyone went out equipped with quite a lot in terms of weapons. Personally, I would be going out the door with a pistol. I actually had a Glock 9mm pistol and an SA-80 rifle, and a substantial quantity of ammunition that, for both weapons that you would more than suffice for even quite a serious contact if we were actually into that position. We were generally going out the door with vehicles. Very, very few times would we go out and do anything on foot. We would dismount the vehicles and go on foot patrols through villages and leave the vehicles manned. We would quite often not take vehicles through some of the villages because the vehicles would be too big to go through the very narrow streets, and very destructive in terms of the roads, because a lot of the villages were very primitive. And again, I'll come back and talk a bit more about that in a while. So we would trundle around, though, a lot of the time in a convoy of vehicles of varying types. And the vehicles changed a lot over time. We got better and better in terms of vehicles with proper protection from explosive devices, so V-shaped hulls underneath that would deflect the blast, as opposed to a flat chassis, which was the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, when I was there, most of the vehicles were flat chassis. They were Land Rovers and weapon-integrated Land Rovers, so they would have quite extensive weaponry on them, including up to .5 machine guns, grenade machine guns, those sorts of things. So you were heavily armed, no question about that. Going out the door, we were well and truly capable of taking on quite a lot of activity if we needed it. And so it should be. And obviously, that required briefings and preparation and training all in its own. And obviously, you had to be ready to go and do all of that. We went some of the time to the range. The RAF regiment guys would go to the range near the base to hone their skills all the time with all of the different types of weapons they had, such that when you went out the door on a patrol, you were genuinely really ready to do whatever came your way. One element that's worth specific mention, because they were so important, was interpreters. We would invariably go out on a patrol with one, usually two, actually, interpreters. Quite often, if we had one, we'll have a military interpreter. If we had someone who actually spoke Dari or Pashto, then we would take them, but we'd also very often take a local interpreter. And they were crucial in terms of the engagement with the locals. They would usually want to disguise their identity, so they would walk around with a face mask on, or a shamag covering their face all the time, so that they were difficult to identify. Because clearly the threat risk to them and their families from the Taliban and recognizing that they were supporting us was enormous. And they have huge courage, and I have an undying respect for the risks they took for us to enable us to do our job. So they were really, really key as an element of the structure to go out and make the whole patrol work. So that's it. That's kind of us tooled up, ready to go. When we left the base, we would mount up on the vehicles, would head out the door. And because on the base, we very much didn't have armed up weaponry, we would go to an arming point where we would actually arm up both the personal weapons, so your pistol and rifle in my case, and you'd go out the door with a magazine on both weapons and a so-called ready state, so a round in the barrel, so you're ready to go. Safety catch, pull the trigger. That's it. That's all. That's the deal. So you're ready for action at a moment's notice. And exactly the same was true for the vehicles. So we'd load up and make ready all of the vehicle-mounted weapon systems. So again, we were kind of instantly available to handle a contact if there was one there. The reverse was true on the way back in. Of course, you'd come back in off patrol and you'd go to the arming de-arming point, and you would make safe all of the weaponry, and that was a really key, a very, very important element of the end of the sortie. You never relax until you finished the patrol and you actually got off the vehicles at the end. You're back at the camp and everything's de-armed and all good, because clearly there was some significant risk of messing around with that and screwing that up. And we were very conscious that had to be done meticulously, which, given that some of these patrols were long, very hot and very arduous, meant that you had to stay very focused to be on it right until you came back in, and then you could actually relax. The moment you went outside the wire and through the gate, there was a palpable change in the kind of tension in the team. You knew that, right, you are now immediately outside the wire. You're vulnerable literally from the get-go, and you had to be very aware of that. We would go obviously on roads where there were roads that we could go on, but obviously roads in Afghanistan are even to this day are somewhat sketchy, and even the kind of good roads are not that great by Western standards. And an awful lot of places it was just dirt tracks, and so you would transit those roads. We would obviously not be the only people on the roads. So one of the things that happened a lot, and the kind of over time the locals had got wise to this, was we would not tolerate vehicles coming towards us or overtaking us at any stage, because obviously of the risk of vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. So at range, we would be making sure that people pulled off the road. They basically knew they had to do that. If they saw a military convoy coming, they would pull off the road, stop their engine, and be kind of very de-escalatory in their own posture. Just occasionally that would go wrong, and you'd have someone who pushed it a little bit and started continuing driving towards you. Very rarely did you ever get overtaken, in my experience, but normally you would have someone coming towards you. And we had a set of drills called escalation of force at that point, where we would actually fire flares initially to warn people that we were you needed to stop and they needed to pay attention to this. Then would ultimately fire warning shots if we needed to do that. And ultimately we would engage targets that didn't stop. The risk was simply too high to the patrol to turn around and allow someone in a car to just drive on past the patrol. That was never allowed. And the locals understood it. We had signage everywhere that made it very clear that was what we were going to do. And unfortunately and inevitably, occasionally that led to some Afghans losing their lives because they pushed it. Most of the ones that happened to, frankly, were the bad guys, and therefore that was fine. Just occasionally, and obviously also tragically, it wasn't. But it was one of those pieces of process that was a really difficult challenge that we had to constantly manage. And every incident, if we discharged a weapon outside, every incident would be investigated. There would be a shooting incident report and an investigation that would follow all of that, and that would exhaustively look at whether we had taken the right action, whether we'd unreasonable, whether we handled all the procedures correctly and dealt with everything as we should have done, etc. But it was a big deal, and the roads were definitely an issue. The other thing with the roads, particularly the non-metalled, i.e. not tarmac roads, was clearly it was quite straightforward to dig stuff into the road that was going to be a nasty surprise for us coming along it. And we would be acutely alert all the time of any kind of disturbed earth or anything that looked like something had recently been done. If that was the case, generally we would hold up short of it, and then we would go and investigate before we actually allowed anybody to cross it. And we were very, very careful doing those investigations, because obviously one of the risks with these kind of patrols is that actually it's not an emplaced IED waiting for you to drive across it, and that's what sets it off. It's actually a so-called command-wired IED where somebody is watching, waiting for you to get close to it, and then they detonate it. And so that was another big risk that we had to be acutely aware of. Some places were considered particularly vulnerable points, self-evidently crossings of roads, big bends, big dips, blind spots over the top of hills, river crossings. Those kind of things were all significant issues where we had to be very, very careful. Not least in the case of something like a river crossing, it took a little time to get the vehicles all across, and we would make sure we did that basically one at a time, and we would have those vehicles that were either side of the river before or after the crossing would be very, very much on alert to make sure that there wasn't some kind of engagement opportunity for us while we were a bit vulnerable in that kind of space. I mentioned that we quite often did key leader engagement, and we did a few things allied to that. So I would often go, and the team actually would just go and meet some of the village elders. But if I was out on a patrol, I would try and do it myself and explain who I was. And some of those events involved, sitting down with them for a cup of tea and something to eat. And one of my great trepidation moments, and I think everyone's trepidation moment out there, was the quality of the water and the quality of the food and these sorts of things, and trying to not to put yourself in a position where you were going to be extraordinarily ill having eaten or drunk something. But at the same time, being acutely aware that it was most discourteous to turn down an offer of tea, etc. And so you occasionally just had to kind of grin and bear it and go for what looked like the least offensive thing on the plate, and certainly hope that the water had been boiled thoroughly before you started drinking from it. And that's not to belittle the lifestyle they led. It's just a bit like going to any country where your gastro structure is rather different to theirs in terms of tolerance, and so the risk was you could actually induce quite a nasty series of gastrointestinal problems if you had the wrong thing. But that was definitely a factor. But the other thing that was a factor on some of the key leader engagement would be we didn't want to turn up fully kind of tooled up, as it were. And when I said earlier on we were self-sufficient, what I perhaps didn't expand on enough was we were wearing clearly combat clothing and boots, etc. We also wore all the time body armor. We had helmets. We had quite a lot of kit attached to the body armor, and bergens that would be attached usually to the vehicle, so you wouldn't be walking around with those on a patrol necessarily. But they had a lot of additional kit in them, again, to cater for the fact you might have to stay out even overnight, potentially. And you needed enough water, you needed to make sure you had enough food, etc., etc. Body armor in particular was big, bulky, heavy stuff, and I was relatively lightly loaded by comparison to a lot of the team that were out with me, and I probably had 30 or 40 kilos of kit. They would have 50 or 60 kilos of kit for sure. So it was a heavy process of what you're carrying and going around with, and again, contrast that with some of the foot patrols out in somewhere like Helmand, where they were on foot. They didn't have vehicles, and they would be carrying all that kit all the day. So, very, very arduous in very hot weather. When I arrived there, the weather was cold and wet, and it was nasty. Within a few weeks of March, I got there in January, it went through essentially from winter to summer. There was no discernible spring, and it was suddenly blazing hot. So 45, 50 degree hot pretty much every day. And therefore, when you were lugging around the gear, then you really, really knew it. And just to exemplify the point, on one particular patrol, I can vividly remember I drank, and in the time we were out that day, and we were out just during the day, I drank 6 liters of water, and I didn't have to go for a pee because obviously my body was just basically pumping it out through sweat, and it was just amazing the amount of water you consumed and how much you needed to consume to stay properly hydrated. But the body armor thing, going back to the key leader engagement, was a distraction, and so were the helmets. So we would try, if we were able to get to a point where we were safe enough and felt we were safe enough with enough overwatch and protection around us, that we could talk to the locals with helmets off, soft hats on, and body armor off some of the time. But we generally would only take the body armor off if we were actually inside somewhere. But that would again be a kind of sign of we're comfortable with you. We want to have a friendly conversation with you. We don't want this to, you to feel that we're in there in full defense mode. And the same, we'd obviously keep our weapons with us, but the weapons were all down and out the way and so on. Whereas clearly some of the time and around the edges of any patrol like that, you would have people on full overwatch, including a sniper team that we would invariably take out with us, who would be looking for any kind of interdiction and any threat that was coming our way. And you had to be very responsive if something was going to affect you. It could affect you quite quickly. We were always very conscious in any kind of paused environment that we were vulnerable over time. So very quickly, the message would probably get out to those that we didn't want it to get out to, that we were there and that we would be in a position that we could be threatened very, very easily. And so the longer we were somewhere, the more acutely aware we were of the risk that potentially we had by staying there. And that shaped kind of what we did and the volume of people we had and the kind of patrols and security we put out around the patrol. But as well as that key leader engagement, which was just trying to persuade the locals that we were the guys they should be supporting and looking after, and therefore please don't support the Taliban, support us. We did stuff that enabled that kind of conversation. And we did a thing called Civil Military Coordination, CIMIC, to turn around and provide capability to the locals. So things they didn't have, we would try and help them with. And while I was there, we did a lot of water wells, for example, where we would put in running water into a village that had never had that before. We would very regularly turn around and look at improving infrastructure. So roads, bridges, those sorts of things to try and help them. And in some instances, that really significantly helped them, where villages would be cut off by a river during the wet season. And we could put a bridge in that would actually make a huge difference to them in terms of the transit time they had from where they wanted to get to. And rather than going around the river by miles, we actually provided a crossing point that would make life an awful lot easier for them. And other things like electricity. And I can vividly remember us turning on the electricity in one village with actually some local Afghan military there as well when we were doing that. And it was one of my comedy moments almost from the time there, because there was a small hiccup of turning the power on in the final analysis. And I think I've got a picture somewhere of it, of a local who just climbed up on the electricity pylon just to make sure that, basically he could flick all the right switches to the right place. And you're going, this is just the health and safety nightmare that you just don't want. Luckily, nothing happened on that particular day, but you can easily see that some things would go very, very wrong with those kind of scenarios. Another thing we did, which was really crucial and very, very helpful to the locals, was we did medical patrols. We would take out a team of medics off the base, and we would usually do this as a deliberate act. This would be the whole patrol would be basically going to a village and setting up a capability to provide them with medical care. And one of the real challenges with doing that was actually providing medical care to ladies who in that society are extremely, extremely reluctant to talk to men or to engage with men or to even be seen in public with men. So very often we would take female doctors out if we had them, or female medics out and nurses out when we had them. And we would make that clear when we arrived through interpreters that this is what we were trying to do. We would provide a covered route for the locals to be able to get to our team. Maintaining security was obviously really key for that as well, around both the perimeter patrol, but also you're very conscious that not every local that we ever encountered was going to be friendly. So that was definitely an issue that we needed to be acutely aware of as we went around doing these kind of things. But it was very interesting. I did a couple of those where we could spend a bit of time talking to the leaders at the same time as obviously the medical care was being dispensed to just about everyone that needed it. And of course, you're dealing with a society that is, if you're looking at it through Western eyes, is just unimaginably far behind, I suppose, in terms of everything we would be used to. When you go into a local Afghan village away from the big cities kind of look like fairly rough, but still big cities. They've got things that you would recognize in any big city around the world. But your average Afghan village in Kandahar province was a mud hut village, open sewers running down the middle of the streets, compound living. So individual families would very much live behind their walls and in their compound space. Very private people, and not least because of the Muslim faith and trying to make sure that the particularly ladies had that full privacy. and very, very primitive by any measure. I've mentioned putting in running water and electricity and things like that, that these was huge challenges, and they faced a lot of challenges. So medically, of course, we could really help them with some fairly basic but very, very important medical care that made a huge, huge difference. And again, was part of the kind of hearts and minds mission, if you like, in terms of trying to make sure they felt that we were on their side and we were doing what they needed us to do to get to the right kind of space eventually. In the villages, walking around in the villages, it was interesting. I mean, I did that a lot, and we'd always be very, very careful. We'd have a patrol that would be staggered in terms of the distance we were covering, and I would never be at the front or the back. I would always be somewhere in the middle, and but again, playing my sort of full part in keeping an eye on what was going on. And you were conscious that some of the time you came across locals who were super friendly, and the kids would always be lovely. The kids were always amazing because they were always beautifully dressed. In a world where you look at this, how do you actually have a facility where your children always look so smart and clean, and yet you're living with nothing that resembles running water or certainly not things like washing machines and all the rest of it. So amazing. But the kids would always be after things like pens and just talking to you and really keen just to have a bit of fun with you. But you'd then suddenly come across some bigger kids, really. I mean, they were teenagers and maybe early 20s who were significantly more challenging some of the time. A lot of them were suspicious at best, hostile at worst. And, and there was a very fine line, which our guys had to walk every single day about how hostile is too hostile. Is this guy actually a threat to us, or is he just basically being a bit stroppy? And it was one of the obvious challenges that I saw up close and personal very frequently when we were out. And again, vitally important for me to be in a position where I understood that, because I then understood the risks and the challenges that my team were facing when they were doing this. And you have to bear in mind that the RAF regiment, the squadrons that were coming out, a lot of the gunners, the junior aviators that were in these patrols, were young men. I mean, they were probably, many instances, 19, 20, 21. I mean, they were themselves very new to this world and facing some really significant challenges. So they grew up enormously quickly when they had to do it. You also, as well as all those young guns, as it were, you had the old hands. You had people who'd been there a long time. They'd been in the regiment a long time. They'd probably been in a number of campaigns. They were the old stagers who were worldly wise. They'd seen a lot of stuff, and they knew just where the kind of risks really became more than they wanted to bear, and where the spider sense really kicked in. And spider sense was a huge thing, where they would feel they just got uncomfortable. They knew that something wasn't quite right, and they were in a position where they could just respond to that and hopefully then detect something, solve the problem, turn around if needs be, avoid a kind of direct confrontation, and try and stay away from trouble. We were not looking on any of these patrols to get into any kind of deliberate contact. That was not the role at all. The role was to basically provide defense and capability around the base and engage if they needed to, but they really didn't want to have to do that. You can probably imagine that one of the challenges they faced was that they were doing this day in, day out for generally a 4-month, sometimes a 6-month tour. And they would be completely understandably nervy when they arrived, obviously, but also as they got close to the end of the tour. They were outside the wire, day in, day out, taking really significant risks, often during that tour, seeing their mates get injured or even killed. And as a result, when you got close to the end and you knew, right, I'm going home next week, then inevitably those patrols became a great deal more tense. There's no two ways about it. They would get worried that, am I actually going to make it out of here? Particularly if something had gone on earlier in the tour that really shook them a lot. And again, I'll talk about that on a different podcast because it was a particular resonance to me. And the courage they had, I was really struck by. I mean, I think, again, I just imagine I translate that forward into what was going on in the hotter war zones, if you like, where we had a lot of young men and some young women, but mainly men still in that frame, who were really brave on a very regular basis, and They didn't know some of the time what they were going to get into on any given day. And when they got into it, they would work as a team, doing what they'd been trained to do, looking after their mates and looking after the team, leaving no one behind, focused on absolutely making sure that they got the job done to the absolute best of their ability. And it was an utter privilege to be out on patrol with these guys and to see some of that and participate in some of that as we were doing it, and do a little good along the way as well, I think. And I'll come back. I mentioned leading by example right at the beginning, and I'll come back on a different episode and talk about that a bit more specifically on one particular instance, because that was where it really resonated. But that's it for this week. I hope that you've enjoyed that and found it interesting. It was certainly one of the fascinating aspects of being out in Kandahar and being the commander on the base, that I could get off the base. That wasn't the case for everybody. A lot of people couldn't get off the base, and they didn't get to see real Afghanistan, and that's a real shame, because inevitably, you go there, you spend 4, 6, whatever it is, months there on your tour, not actually getting out to see what goes on outside the wire was undoubtedly a pity. But at the same time, we couldn't do it. It wasn't tourism. We were not looking to turn around and put people out at unnecessary risk, and there was definitely risk. So we had to be very, very sensible about it. But I certainly found it a great privilege and something that I will never forget. I have absolutely never forgotten some of the key moments from doing that, and I don't think I ever will. It was very, very special. That's it for this week. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Take care. Speak soon. Bye now. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode where I relive some of the time out in Afghanistan, and particularly one of the sort of grittier aspects of what I was doing going out on patrol with the RAF Regiment. If you've enjoyed it, as ever, please share it. Please get the message out to others. Let them listen and benefit from this as well. If you find it valuable and you really think that this is useful stuff for you, and you're getting insights and things that you can actually apply to yourself in some way, shape or form, then please consider supporting the podcast financially. You can do that by supporting the show via the Support the Show link in your platform. That will take you to my Patreon site, which is www.patreon.com/leading4life. And at that site, you can actually turn around and become either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show for very little money that will make a very big difference. So please think about it. If you're a regular listener and you're finding this valuable, then I would massively appreciate you just giving me a little bit of a leg up in terms of helping me to maintain it and cover the costs and make sure that I can continue doing it for the longer term. Thanks ever so much, though. All the very best. Appreciate you listening. Even if you're not going to be a supporter of the show financially, then your listening is good for me, and I really appreciate that. So much appreciated. Take care.